It was a much-awaited moment, a crucial one strategically for India, Ukraine and all G7 nations. PM Modi met Ukrainian President Zelenskyy in Hiroshima on the sidelines of the G7 summit. First in-person meeting since the start of the conflict. India always has been the proponent of dialogue, and even in its latest message, PM Modi asserted that India stands on the side of peace and that cooperation and collaboration should define our times and not conflict. However, lately G7 countries, US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, have agreed on more sanctions against Russia and demanded a complete withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. This makes India's stand on the issue much more important at this juncture because so far, viewers, it has walked a line of fine balance, and this time these countries are closely watching India's stand on the issue. As for Kyiv, it is looking beyond its Western allies for military support as it prepares for a highly anticipated counter-offensive. On the other hand, a warm hug and a pat at the back and laughter. This was the bonhomie of US President Joe Biden. So look at the pictures and look at them closely. This is how Joe Biden, the US President, met Prime Minister Modi at the G7 summit. A vision for united future and transforming the world order. While G7 is currently underway in Hiroshima, Modi diplomacy is making a mark. Not only Indo-US but Indo-UK stronger ties were on display in Hiroshima, and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hugged Prime Minister Modi in a warm gesture. Prime Minister Modi, along with other world leaders, attended the working session 6 of the G7 summit, with geopolitical challenges taking the center stage. Now, during the discussion, PM also held bilateral talks with the French, the Japanese, the Vietnamese and the South Korean leaders. The world leaders discussed Indo-Pacific trade, climate change, security and health, among other things. Let's quickly play out to this interaction. Prime Minister Modi and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy held bilaterals. This is what transpired at the beginning.
एक डेढ़ साल से हम लगातार फोन पर तो बातचीत करते रहे हैं, लेकिन ग्लासगो के बाद लंबे अरसे के बाद आज मिलने का अवसर मिल रहा है। यूक्रेन में चल रहा युद्ध पूरे विश्व के लिए बहुत बड़ा मुद्दा है। पूरे विश्व पर इसके अनेक प्रकार के प्रभाव भी पड़े, लेकिन मैं इसे राजनीति या अर्थव्यवस्था का मुद्दा नहीं मानता। मेरे लिए यह मानवता का मुद्दा है, मानवीय मूल्यों का मुद्दा है। युद्ध की पीड़ा क्या होती है, ये आप हम सबसे ज्यादा जानते हैं। लेकिन पिछले साल जब हमारे बच्चे यूक्रेन से वापस आए, तब उन्होंने परिस्थितियों का जो वर्णन किया, उसमें मैं आपकी वेदना और यूक्रेन के नागरिकों की वेदना भली भांति समझ पाता था, उसका अंदाज लगा पाता था। और मैं आपको विश्वास दिलाता हूं कि इसके समाधान के लिए भारत और निजी रूप से मैं स्वयं, हमसे जो कुछ भी हो सकता है हम अवश्य करेंगे।
Now let's quickly open this up, and joining us, Kawal Sibul, needs no introduction, former Foreign Secretary, and Brahma Chelani, Strategic Affairs expert, two of the finest experts on foreign policy, geopolitics. Viewers, good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Sibul, let me begin by asking you, let's just begin by breaking down, why is India's participation at the G7 so important? What is the significance of it?
Look, this is not the first time that India has been invited to G7 meetings. The first time was when I was in France, and Vajpayee was invited. And since then, so many G7 meetings India has participated. Of course, this time, our participation in the G7 has got added significance because we are the president of the G20, we are the president of the SCO, we are taking the leadership of the Global South, and there's an understanding that India is now able to voice the concerns and expectations of the Global South in this very complex geopolitical situation that has developed, where actually it is in some ways even worse than the Cold War. And the Ukraine conflict has become so complex where neither Russia nor the West can retreat, and there is no prospect of a solution through dialogue and diplomacy. And therefore, all these countries are interested in getting somehow India on board, as they're doing with China. They tell China, can you intercede and advise Putin to end this war? So they want to also put that kind of pressure on India to push it to play some kind of a mediatory role with the added stature that we've got because of these presidencies and Modi's own personality and the fact that he has now an image at the global level which is much more effective and impressive as compared to recent prime ministers in recent years. Modi has been also talking about dialogue and diplomacy, about peace. But one important thing I want to underline here, that it was very wise on his part to have met Zelenskyy, because China has taken the initiative to send a special envoy to Ukraine and to Russia and to 2, 3, 4 West European countries and project itself as a peacemaker, even while it is fully supporting Russia on the basics of the conflict. Now, if India were to turn its back to Zelenskyy and not seek this opportunity to meet him, then our position that we are for dialogue and diplomacy would sound hollow. So if you are for dialogue and diplomacy, then we should talk to all sides and also not leave the field free totally to China to get the maximum publicity advantage out of this. But as I see from what Prime Minister has said, and I can also, I am quite convinced that beyond what he said, he is not going to be able to do anything. And very interestingly, he has said that for him, the issue is humanitarian, or human values, not politics and economics. So he doesn't want to get into the nitty-gritty of these issues in terms of ending the war and everything else. He's talking about the casualties and the sufferings that are taking place. So he's taken a very fine line, which puts him in good light in terms of his concern for the human aspect of the conflict, without getting into the politics of it, because what Zelenskyy wants, not only from China, but he would want from any other interlocutor, is actually to persuade President Putin to sign up on his agenda for peace, which is fully backed by the West, which means restoration of Donbass, restoration of Crimea, reparations by Russia, and war crimes trial of Russians. This is just not going to take off at all. Okay. There's no way. You can impose this kind of an agenda if Japan and Germany, Russia was defeated on the ground. This is not going to happen. It's totally unrealistic. But it's good he has met him.
Totally unrealistic, but Ambassador Sibal there being charitable, if I can use the word, he says it's good that, we've at least made that stance in overture. Professor Chalani, I have a larger question for you, sir, before, I'm sure you have a view on the Modi-Zelenskyy meet. But at a time when, people are talking about the fall of multilateralism and, they say, look at what is happening at the NATO summit and the G7, the growing gap between the East and the West. How crucial is this meeting?
You mean the meeting between Modi and Zelenskyy or the G7 meeting?
The G7 meeting, sir.
Okay. See, the G7 was established in the mid-1970s when economic power was concentrated in the Western world. But since then, power has gradually been shifting from the West to the East. And many analysts in the West are beginning to question the relevance of the G7. What is the G7 able to deliver? For example, the G7 still claims a global leadership role in economic management. But the G20 is the main forum for global economic management. So what is the G7's role? This is a question that is haunting the G7 in terms of its relevance. But I think the fact that in the G7 summit in Hiroshima, which is the city of peace, the city that symbolizes the ravages of war, that we're discussing peace, bringing about peace, ending this war in Ukraine is very important. The fact is that this war in Ukraine is affecting everybody in the world. It's affecting all countries. It's especially affecting the least developing countries, especially the countries that are cash-strapped, these countries, including, we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, that these countries are bearing the brunt of the geopolitical and economic fallout from the war. But interestingly, even as Modi promised that India will do what it can to bring about peace in Ukraine, the fact is that at this juncture, there are no takers for peace in the Western world. And this is the irony of it, that at this stage, Western powers are rushing billions of dollars of additional lethal weapons to Ukraine. They are saying that there can be no role for diplomacy until Ukraine launches the so-called spring offensive, which has been in the offing for many weeks now, but still there's no sign of it. But the US, for example, is now going to be shipping $3 billion of extra weapons to Ukraine. The Brits have sent cruise missiles and other lethal weaponry of late. Germany is going to send $3 billion or more of additional weaponry to Ukraine. So Ukraine is being flooded with additional Western weaponry. And in fact, it's being encouraged to launch this offensive against Russian forces. The fact is that the war has reached a military stalemate. Neither side is in a position to make significant advance on the battlefield, let alone be able to achieve total victory on the battlefield. So in a situation where you have a stalemate, do you continue with this war of attrition, or do you use diplomacy to bring about a ceasefire, an armistice? Now, this is the only way you can actually end the bloodshed, the destruction, is through an armistice agreement. The question is, how much time will that take? Will it take, like it happened in the Korean War in the early 1950s? It took 2 years after it reached a stalemate for an armistice agreement to be reached. I hope it will not take 2 years of additional fighting in Ukraine before we reach a ceasefire agreement.
But if it comes to, Ambassador Sibal, if it comes to actually doing something, walking the talk, which you think is highly unlikely, what can India do? What can New Delhi do?
I don't think we have much to play with. Now, even in the G7 communique, they are saying they're going to support Ukraine militarily, politically, financially, as long as it takes. It is an open-ended commitment to Ukraine. What does as long as it takes mean? The Brahma just said that it may take 2 years to reach an armistice, so they'll keep supporting them till both sides are exhausted and they can't tolerate the pressures of the conflict. Now, you see, if there were any sign from the West that they are willing to look at dialogue and diplomacy as an option and give some signals that instead of jacking up their military support and giving more and more lethal weapons, Storm Shadow, cruise missiles and everything else, that they are holding back and giving some kind of making some kind of a good faith gesture that we are holding back, and therefore we would like to request the friends of Russia to advise them to hold back, then okay, there is a start of some kind. But if you are saying that, look, we are not going to accept a ceasefire, because the ceasefire would mean a frozen conflict. We want that Zelenskyy and Ukraine should gain some victory on the battlefield, push Russia in a corner, and then push Russia in to negotiate, which means that have Russia negotiate from a position of weakness. Now, if this is what the West wants to do, what can India do? If West itself is not a taker for the dialogue and diplomacy at this stage, and supposing our Prime Minister went to Putin and said, let's have dialogue and diplomacy, he can turn out and say, but those guys don't want any dialogue and diplomacy. And he's been saying that he's not unwelcomed the Chinese initiative, President Putin that is, but he has said that the other side is not willing to negotiate. So it's a stalemate. The whole idea is to put political and moral pressure on countries like India to project Russia as the recalcitrant party, which is not willing to negotiate, and therefore the entire burden should be on Russia, and therefore create a misunderstanding between us and Russia. I don't think we should play this game. I think Prime Minister is taking the right stand. That is a humanitarian issue.
Right.
India will give humanitarian aid, do whatever it is possible. If we are asked to, as he has said and Foreign Minister has said, that if he asked to play a role at the right time, we are willing to play.
We will play a role at the right time, and the underline and the emphasis really is on humanitarian efforts, that this is a time for peace, not for conflict. Professor Chelani, Ambassador Sibal, always a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you for joining us on Times Now.